Okay, so I don't think we have Anita yet. We will come back to her later. So I'm just going to turn to someone I have here in the studio, Bobi Wine, as an opposition leader and member, a former member of the parliament. What would you say are the political and economic barriers that prevent young Africans from formal political participation in your country and maybe even for the rest of Africa? And how have you been able to surmount them?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Greetings, viewers. I'll talk about Africa largely, but allow me to zoom in to Eastern Africa, and more particularly to Uganda, where I live. The challenges of Africa, Uganda in particular, is the generational divide, which is not only in age, but is also in mentality. And I'm very glad that you mentioned it, that we are stuck with 20th century mentality and leaders, and yet we are largely a 21st century population. We are stuck with leaders that have an old mentality and a mentality of authoritarianism. In Uganda, the problem, and I believe largely in Africa, is authoritarianism, where we have a leader that has been in power for 36 years. Unfortunately, even when the voices are raised, they are ignored or squashed with brutality. Now, this is a challenge. How we've been able to surmount them, I would not really be quick to say we've surmounted them. We've made the efforts, but the efforts have been crushed. And unfortunately, the development partners are not innocent to this. We really appreciate the attention that is put on Africa, but the attention and the statements alone do not cut the result. It is the action that we desire. And when that action, when that partnership is put in action, I strongly believe that Africa will be where it really deserves to be. I really believe that Africans, especially young Africans, will live to their full potential.
Thank you, Bobi Wine, for those very strong thoughts. The challenge of authoritarianism. And this is also, this goes hand in hand with a disappointment in governance from young people. I think it was a 2019 Mo Ibrahim Forum report that found that 60% of African, especially young people, think that their governments are doing a very bad job, or a fairly bad job, at addressing the needs of young people. I think in response to some of these authoritarianism trends in Africa, we've seen since 2010, a wave of peaceful protests across the continent. So my next question will go to Isa. It appears young Africans are speaking, especially, as Bobi Wine said earlier, but the governments are not listening. The leaders, the older generation are not listening to them. Why is the African youth voice not making a significant difference in governance? Why is it not being creating change despite the numbers that we have? Okay, we don't have Aisha, so I would ask you, Bobi, again to weigh in on this one.
Well, thank you very much. Africa has significantly suffered an attack on democracy and democratic principles. It has suffered an attack on human rights. It has suffered an attack on the rule of law. And like I said, while the authoritarian leaders in Africa are having their field day crushing democracy and crushing any alternative voices, particularly the young voices, it has not been made better by the development partners. I'm of the view that if the world listened and indeed acted to the values that bring us together as humanity, then Africa would live its full potential.
Thank you. We're looking at how Africa can live its full potential, but unfortunately, I don't think we can if we don't bridge this generational divide. But young people, have their own responsibility in this. Sure. And I think I would ask Ms. Kesani if she's joined us to address this issue, because despite being very vocal on social issues online, most young people dominate conversations on politics on Twitter, on Facebook, and on all various social media platforms. But I'm conspicuously missing on election day. Why is that so, and what can be done for youth numbers to count on in the polls and in the elections?
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. So this is rather a very subjective question to really ask, because my voice doesn't necessarily represent the youth at large. But as someone, as a young person in South Africa who did not take part in the local government elections late November last year, we predominantly don't go to the polling stations because no matter what we say or what we fight for or the concerns we raise on social media, nothing changes. There is no youth representation in our government, right? And when I'm talking about youth representation, I'm talking about people that actually have the power and the influence, right, to change policies and decisions in our government. So representation is lacking so much. Our government has a tendency of doing things as tick box exercises. They will try and enact transformation policies or policies of any kind to ensure that they look like they are adhering to international standards, whereas they're actually not. And as someone that works in informal settlements, which are reached by poverty and inequality, nothing has changed. It's been 28 years into democracy, but people in informal settlements are still complaining or trying to get water and sanitation, just basic service delivery. So why should we as young people actually vote? I decide to not vote because it's not that I'm oppressed or I'm not allowed to vote, but it's a decision that I take as an individual to not vote. I take not voting as a protest of some sort that hopefully our government would use this time before the national elections in 2024 to actually reassess and reevaluate what's happening. Youth unemployment is very high. We've actually reached about 70% of youth unemployment in South Africa. Corruption continues to go up. No representation, no accountability, nothing actually works. So the youth is just being used as a tick box exercise, but we're actually not being put in positions of power, positions of influence, especially if you do not actually adhere to political standards in South Africa. If you speak out loud, you'll actually be excluded. So I think us not playing an active role in all of this is actually due to the fact that nobody listens. Nobody listens. So for how long are we going to protest? For how long are we going to withdraw our votes? So I think it's a good time now, especially for South Africa, leading up to the national elections in 2024, for them to actually reassess and have proper public participation, consultations with the youth, and actually ask, what is it that we want? Whatever approach they need to have a people-centered approach, which actually takes everything into consideration when they actually enact policy to ensure that we regain our faith and actually believe in everything that they're actually telling us or promising us, for that matter.
Thank you, Ms. Kesani, for those comments. I'm just wondering, how, we're going to press for change if we are despondent, because I can hear a bit of despondence in her voice, and it's understandable, having shouted at the top of your voice and not been heard. There's a temptation to disconnect from the system. But let's hear a bit from our European partners here. And I would like to ask Eric, who's also joining us online, about this situation, how it's been experienced in Europe. Is not online?
Eric is with us. Yes, I'm here.
Oh my God, Eric. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So, Eric, I'm glad I have you here, because I've lost a lot of my online speakers, but you're here, and I'm happy you are. And you've been listening to this conversation we've been having about Africa and the generational gap. And I just want to have your take on, how Europe experience is different from Africa, and how, Europe is building capacity for young people to co-create solutions and co-lead with the older generation. And what lessons have you learned?
Merci d'abord de...
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for welcoming here, not virtually, but physically. And thank you as well for the invitation to this discussion, which I think is essential for Africa, but also for all of the continents, and including the European continent. I'm a new member of the Development Committee in the Parliament, and I'm sure that some of the things I will say may be a little naive, and I prefer to say that before I speak. But what I see is that the question of young people and intergenerational issues, these are issues for Africa, and I'll come back to that, but they're also valid for Europe as well. And so perhaps the things we're talking about for Africa would also apply to Europe. And I think that what's true for Europe is also true for France. We find it difficult to get young people to participate in public life and in the taking of decision. And in France, there's a study which has just been carried out just a few days ago, and it shows that young people are very disinterested in public life and political issues. And I think that the causes, perhaps to a lesser extent, but are similar to those on the African continent. And I just want to explain what I mean by that. I think that it's a question of what you said, Bobi Wine, if I can call you that, and also what was said by Ms. Kenzani, who just spoke. I think that in Europe, in France, there isn't really a space in which young people's voice can be heard. But I think in Africa, it's even more difficult, because you just talked about the point which I think is essential, is governance and the legitimacy of certain forms of democracy, and which has been indicated by international organizations. This is something which has been said by Ms. Kenzani. If young people in Africa aren't listened to, if they're not part of the decision-making process, then it's very difficult for them to be involved in actions. And I think that this is something which is very true for young people, but also raises the issue of legitimate democracy and governance. And I think before we start creating partnerships, it's important for the international organizations to be asking this at the very highest level. I mean, you were just making points, and I think if we want to make progress on our partnership, this is something what we have to do. I think in a way what we need to do is reinvent in a contemporary way what we know, and what I like is a specific forum for young people, for their voices to be heard, and to create a link between the generations which have experience and those which have energy. We need these areas where people can speak and they can be listened to, because if they don't feel that their voice is being heard, then they don't want to participate in political life. And so it's a question at different levels. Legitimacy of representation, and that's something we have to listen to. And then the question of listening, because young people want to see results in their everyday life, but that's not what's happening in Africa or in Europe, in different member states. And so it seems simple, but it's actually very complex, because it's a global or holistic approach which is needed. That's the terminology we use here in Brussels. And so what I think would be good is to build this forum. We know that there are social levers. We talk about the autonomization of young people. We can have a cultural approach. We can have an economic approach. But if it's not clear, we can't do valid work in the area of the fight against poverty. Access to culture, access to knowledge, access to employment, access to activities. There are levers which to make sure that young people are part of the democratic process, but we need to make sure that the process is truly democratic. That's what we really need to look at first, and to make sure that it's addressing the largest number of people. And perhaps what's exacerbating things in Africa is, as you said, 70% of the African population is under the age of 30, and that amplifies the issue. And I think it's something we have to look at different levels. We need to look at the democratic issue, the legitimacy, and then the question of the tools the involvement in social and cultural life. And I think that really is the basis for a new partnership, as has been launched by our commissioner, if we want to be able to participate tomorrow and to have reciprocity in terms of development on these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Eric, for such insightful contributions, especially the contribution that recommends that we have specific forums for young people to express themselves, spaces created within our democracies for young people to actually have a voice. And I think this is a very strong recommendation that we'll probably be discussing a bit later as we look at how to mainstream the youth voice. But it's also important that, you know, some of the institutional restrictions that are there to prevent young people from participating in the mainstream conversations that those institutional or procedural spaces are opened up. And I'm going to ask Manji, who's from Nigeria, to tell us a bit more about this. In Nigeria, we had the Not Too Young to Run youth-led movement, which was supported